A girl feeds a homeless boy every day. 22 years later, she's accused of something she didn't do. Upon seeing her, the judge's eyes fill with tears. Hello, welcome. Please enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Young Isabel was always known for her unique kindness. Since she was little, she saw the world with empathy, and any small injustice seemed to hurt her deeply. One day, on her way back from school, something made her stop in her tracks. Sitting by a trash bin was a boy her age, thin and wearing dirty clothes, staring at a half-eaten piece of bread that Isabel was holding. The boy had a tired expression, hollow eyes, and a serious look, yet there was a quiet gentleness in his face. Isabel approached him slowly, fearing she might scare him off. She felt she had to do something but hesitated. What would he think of her? After all, how could someone so young live like that, with no place to go after school, no snack in hand, something so common for her and her friends? With a shy smile, she knelt down and offered the bread. The boy hesitated, looking at her as if he wasn't used to kindness, as if this gesture was something unexpected. Seeing his uncertainty, Isabel broke the bread in half and placed a piece closer to him, as if offering a gift. He took the food slowly, without saying a word, looking away from Isabel while he took small bites, as if each one was precious. Isabel stayed by his side, in silence, feeling a profound peace that she couldn't explain. After a few minutes, the boy finally looked at her with a shy, grateful expression, as if that simple act had meant more than Isabel could have imagined. "What's your name?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. He lifted his head and, almost as if apologizing, answered, "Marcos." From that day on, Isabel decided that whenever she could, she would bring something for Marcos. It wasn't just bread. She also brought fruits, cookies, and little treats that she saved from her own lunch. She felt it was her duty, a silent promise, to do what she could so that Marcos wouldn't feel invisible. That simple, quiet friendship began to transform Isabel's life. This bond, though understated, became part of their daily routine and felt essential to them both. Almost every day, on her way to or back from school, Isabel would pass by the spot where she knew she'd find Marcos. There he was, always in the same place, by an old wall, with his clothes growing more worn and his gaze often distant, as if he carried a story that no one had taken the time to hear. With time, Isabel began to bring more than just food. When she arrived beside Marcos, she also brought a smile and encouraging words, trying to offer him what felt like a bit of hope. She told him stories about school, her classes, and her friends, trying to make him feel like part of her world. At first, he only listened in silence, looking at the ground or his own hands, unsure of how to respond. But gradually, Marcos began to open up. One day, he told her he liked to draw with pieces of charcoal he found on the street. Isabel, curious, asked what he liked to draw. Embarrassed, he said he drew landscapes, places he imagined, since he'd never left that small part of the city. She promised to bring him paper and colored pencils. Simple for her, but something that would be a true treasure for him. When Marcos held the pencils for the first time, it seemed like he was holding something fragile and precious. He looked at the colors, turning the pencils between his fingers, and then looked at Isabel with an expression of wonder. Those small items meant much more to him. They were proof that someone believed in his talent, even though no one else had seen his drawings. While he drew, Isabel watched in silence, amazed at how Marcos, so young and with so little, could express a world of imagination. These encounters, which became more frequent, started to change Isabel deeply. She began to see the world with more compassion, realizing how a simple act of kindness could impact someone's life. Over time, Isabel felt that the conversations and care she gave to Marcos ignited a purpose within her that she hadn't anticipated. From those moments, seeing the sparkle in Marcos's eyes as he drew, Isabel began to dream bigger. She didn't want just to give temporary relief. She wanted Marcos and others like him to have a fair chance in the world. That feeling grew inside her, and as a teenager, Isabel decided she wanted to be a lawyer. For her, fighting for justice was more than a career. It was a way to give back to Marcos in a grand way, transforming a small gesture into something that could change lives. This dream drove her to study with dedication, and though the coursework was challenging, the memory of Marcos, sitting by those dirty walls, kept her going. She remembered how he always held each piece of bread so carefully, and that reminded her of the importance of her own efforts. Each minute of study was a silent promise to him and to others who needed to be seen. Getting into university was just the beginning. Isabel faced many challenges like any law student. The classes were intense, the books seemed endless, and the laws demanded great attention. But the image of Marcos never left her mind, especially the look of surprise and gratitude he had whenever he received a small act of kindness. It was as if each paragraph she read was a way to reach the justice he deserved. Soon, Isabel's passion and purpose began to catch the attention of her professors, who saw her as a dedicated student. But there was something more to her, a sensitivity that went beyond legal codes. When asked about the reason for her dedication, Isabel never spoke about status or money. She replied, almost enigmatically, that she wanted to be the voice for those who were never heard. Some classmates laughed, thinking it was a naive ideal, but Isabel wasn't discouraged. She knew her words held deep meaning, and that kept her steady, even on the hardest days. Every test, every practice, and every challenge brought her closer to the day when she could actually fight for people like Marcos. When Isabel finally graduated as a lawyer, the weight of the moment brought back memories of the times she walked those paths, bringing food and a smile to Marcos. As she had promised herself, she started working to help those who had no voice, offering free legal aid to the city's homeless. As soon as she opened her small law office, Isabel became a safe haven for those. They had already lost hope. The place was simple. With used furniture and shelves filled with books Isabel had either donated or bought over time. But for those who entered, each corner overflowed with dignity and respect. There was an old chair next to her desk that Isabel kept for her clients, a small but significant detail showing how much she valued every story that came her way. The first to walk into the office was a woman named Maria, whose hands were calloused, and whose gaze reflected exhaustion and despair. Maria was facing eviction due to years of unpaid rent and had no close family to turn to. She sat in the chair with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. Isabel listened carefully, without interrupting, and when Maria finished, she held her hands and promised to help. In the following days, Isabel threw herself into the case, visiting the building where Maria lived, speaking to neighbors, and even meeting with the landlord. She explained that Maria was a good person facing hard times and that evicting her would be cruel. After days of intense negotiations, Isabel managed to secure an agreement. Maria could stay in her home and pay rent based on what she could afford. When Isabel delivered the news, the woman cried with gratitude, hugging her deeply. Maria was just the beginning. Soon, Isabel's reputation grew, and more people began to seek her help, each with a story of abandonment or injustice. There was Miguel, a young man wrongly accused of a crime simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, whom Isabel defended until his innocence was proven. Then there was Anna, a single mother fighting to keep custody of her children after an abusive divorce. Isabel gave herself to every case as though it were her only one, working late into the night, reviewing evidence, and refusing to accept a no as an answer. As these cases piled up, Isabel realized something profound. Each person she helped reminded her of her original purpose. She saw in their eyes the same need for care and dignity she had recognized in the boy who drew dreams on paper. Isabel put her heart and soul into her work, and her passion for justice led her to face increasingly complex and delicate situations. One day, a perfect opportunity came her way, defending a community about to be evicted for a major construction project by a wealthy businessman. This case had everything Isabel sought. It was a battle between the powerful and the powerless, a chance to prove that, with truth and justice on your side, anyone could win, no matter how impossible it seemed. She threw herself into it with all her energy, meeting with each family, listening to their stories, and hearing their ties to the land they had lived on for years. For many, it was the only home they had ever known, and the thought of losing it was like losing part of their soul. Isabel decided not only to fight for these families in court but also to take their stories to the media, drawing attention and creating public pressure on the businessman. What she didn't expect was how the intensity of her actions would unsettle the powerful. One day, after a tense meeting about the case, Isabel returned to her office to find an anonymous envelope on her desk. Inside were photos taken from a distance, clearly meant to intimidate her. It was a threat warning her to drop the case. For a moment, Isabel hesitated, thinking of all the people who depended on her, the families whose homes were at stake, and all the years she had dreamed of defending those no one else would defend. Resolute, she decided to ignore the threat and intensify her efforts to help the community. Then, a devastating blow came. One cold morning, as Isabel prepared for an important hearing, she received a call. The voice on the other end was cold and emotionless. "Isabel, I regret to inform you that you are under investigation." Isabel couldn't believe it. She, who had always worked with integrity and justice, was now being accused of fraud and corruption. The accusations were serious. The complaint claimed she had accepted bribes and manipulated evidence in her cases. It was a well-orchestrated plot, and the evidence seemed to be piling up. Fake documents, false witnesses, transactions she had never made. Isabel knew she was the victim of a malicious scheme, but panic began to set in. Her reputation, built over years of hard work, was at risk. Friends and colleagues who had once admired her began to distance themselves. On the streets, she felt the glances of suspicion, the whispers of accusation. The office that had once been a haven for the downtrodden now felt cold and empty. Anonymous letters, threatening phone calls, and people doubting her integrity. Isabel was isolated, as though she were the only one who knew the truth in a world that now considered her guilty. Fear took root inside her, blending with an overwhelming sense of injustice. From that moment on, Isabel entered a nightmare. Each day, the sense of being hunted and mistrusted grew. She tried her best to stay strong and trust that the truth would come to light, but the evidence against her was so well-crafted, so perfectly aligned, that even her closest allies began to doubt her. When Isabel tried to explain herself, it felt as though no one was listening. The investigators treated her as if she were just another criminal trying to evade justice, not someone who had spent her life fighting for it. They combed through every detail of her life, every phone call, every bank transaction, desperately trying to find something that would validate their version of events. Isabel felt like a prisoner, not behind bars, but trapped by her own reputation. Her office, once a place of solace, was now constantly under scrutiny. Her computers seized, her documents taken, her files examined with invasive thoroughness. It felt as though every part of her life was under a microscope, and with each visit, the investigators acted with silent cruelty, leaving a pervasive atmosphere of judgment. One day, an inspector, particularly skeptical, approached Isabel and asked with a tone of accusation, "Why do you care so much about these cases? Why would a lawyer like you bother with people who can't pay?" Isabel was stunned. The answer was obvious to her, but in that moment words seemed insufficient. How could she explain the depth of her purpose, the reason she had chosen this path when everything around her suggested no one else believed in it? The questions kept coming. It felt as though every action she took was misinterpreted with suspicion, as if everything she did had a hidden agenda. Isabel watched as her colleagues began to drift away, each one afraid that being associated with her might endanger their own reputations. Even the families she had helped stopped reaching out, scared of being branded as accomplices. Gradually, loneliness became her only companion. Time, once a constant ally, became her enemy. Each day dragged on, bringing new layers of anguish and uncertainty. The isolation was palpable, and Isabel felt more suffocated with each passing moment, as her once supportive circle of friends, allies, and colleagues shrank. One night, unable to bear the weight of her thoughts, Isabel found herself wandering the quiet streets. She passed by familiar places, the cafe where she used to stay late, reviewing cases, the square where she found inspiration watching the hustle and bustle of the city, and even the bench where she'd sat, taking notes on her toughest cases. Now, everything felt hollow and meaningless. as if those memories had been tainted by the cloud of suspicion that now followed her. Eventually, Isabel found herself standing in front of an old church. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint light inside seemed to offer peace that contrasted sharply with the storm inside her. Hesitant, she stepped inside and sat in the back, away from prying eyes. There, in the quiet of the night, Isabel allowed herself to cry. The loneliness, the injustice, became too much to bear. She wondered if she would ever clear her name, or if she would be forever defined by the false accusations against her. For the first time, she felt the weight of doubt press down on her. She began to wonder if, in her pursuit of justice, she might have overlooked someone, hurt someone without meaning to, and if that was the reason for the animosity now directed at her. Could it be that her dedication had unintentionally caused the very resentment that had now turned against her? As Isabel left the church, she understood something harsh. Even if she were innocent, there were forces beyond her control, and perhaps she would never be able to prove her truth. The day of the trial came, and Isabel felt as though she were about to be thrown into an abyss with no bottom. Each beat of her heart was a reminder of the uncertainty ahead. As she entered the courtroom, the weight of the accusations seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, Isabel wondered if she could continue to fight. The trial began, but Isabel quickly noticed something unusual in the tone of the judge's voice, as though he was carrying a weight that he was struggling to conceal. Each word he spoke seemed to bear a personal burden, one that no one in the room could understand. He read the accusations clearly, but his gaze occasionally lingered on Isabel a little longer than expected, as if he was trying to read something beyond the woman sitting in the defendant's chair. The situation's irony was painfully clear. Isabel felt Marcos's presence as a constant reminder of the battle she had fought for justice, a symbol that her efforts had impacted lives in ways she could not have predicted. And now, the very boy she had once helped selflessly had become the man who could either condemn her or restore the life that had been ripped away from her. When the trial began, Marcos quickly composed himself, trying to mask the flood of emotions stirring inside him. He was the judge now, the one responsible for making the final decision about the woman who had once been a beacon of light in his life. The memories of their shared past seemed to assault him, haunting him with an intensity that was hard to contain. The shared pieces of bread, the quiet conversations after school, the days when Isabel showed him kindness without asking for anything in return. Now, sitting in the courtroom, wearing the robes of authority and impartiality, Marcos realized that his role went beyond that of a judge. He was facing a moral dilemma that few would understand. In that room, Isabel was not just an accused person. She was a reflection of his journey, someone who had inspired every step he took to rise from the streets and reach the position he now held. As the evidence was presented, Marcos listened carefully to every detail, but his heart ached with each new accusation. The words of the prosecution, cold and methodical, cut through Isabel mercilessly, and he wondered how it was possible that this woman, who had devoted her life to helping others, was now sitting in that chair, being treated as a criminal. He reviewed the evidence and testimonies with care, but something inside him refused to accept that Isabel could be guilty of what they claimed. During breaks and as witnesses testified, Marcos found himself lost in conflicting thoughts. How could he judge someone to whom he owed so much? How could he set aside the immense impact she had on his life while also fulfilling his duty to be fair and impartial? It was an internal battle fought with every composed expression, in every careful movement, as he tried to keep his emotions hidden. When a recess was called, Marcos remained seated, not daring to look directly at Isabel, but feeling her gaze on him. He sensed that she could feel the depth of the emotional struggle he was undergoing, knowing how torn he was between his duty and his feelings. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to be carried back to their shared memories, searching for answers in the past. He recalled how she encouraged him to dream, how she always told him that he was capable of anything, even when his circumstances seemed impossible. The trial resumed, and each word spoken by Marcos felt heavy with the weight of the decision that lay ahead. As the trial continued, Marcos's inner conflict grew stronger, like a storm brewing inside him. Each new witness added more weight to the accusation against Isabel, and although he kept his expression neutral, his heart raced with each new detail that seemed to confirm her guilt in the eyes of others. But he knew in his heart that this woman before him was not a criminal. Then, a surprising twist occurred that would change the course of the trial. A witness who had not been listed was called to the stand. It was Dona Guadalupe, an elderly woman with gray hair and a penetrating gaze, who moved with difficulty but carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded attention in the room. When she began to speak, her voice, though low and trembling, seemed to echo through the courtroom as though carrying with it years of untold stories and suffering. "I've known this young woman since she was a child," Dona Guadalupe began, turning her gaze to Isabel. "Every day after school, Isabel passed by my candy stand. I remember how she would share her snack with a boy who sat quietly in the corner. They never disturbed anyone. They just sat there, talking like friends." Marcos listened intently, his heart tightening with each word that seemed so familiar and personal. Dona Guadalupe continued, speaking to the jury now. "That young woman sitting there never denied help to anyone in need. Whatever the evidence says, I know she is a woman with a pure heart. I am here today because she helped me once, at a time when she probably doesn't even remember." Her testimony caused a stir in the courtroom, but for Marcos, it was a reminder of what he had been trying to convince himself of all along. He knew Isabel was the woman Dona Guadalupe described, and the accusations against her now seemed even more absurd. At the end of her testimony, Dona Guadalupe locked eyes with Isabel, and they exchanged a quiet glance, a silent understanding that carried the history of their connection. Isabel gave a faint smile, silently thanking her, before nodding slightly. Marcos caught a fleeting tear in Isabel's eye. That was the Isabel he knew, the one who had the ability to touch the lives of everyone she encountered, even without realizing it. Marcos felt the weight of Dona Guadalupe's testimony deep in his soul. He was now at a crossroads, about to decide the future of someone who had meant so much to him. He knew that any decision he made would ripple far beyond the courtroom. After Dona Guadalupe's testimony, an even more unexpected event occurred. A man entered the room, hesitant, his gaze fixed on the floor as though burdened by the weight of the truth he was about to reveal. It was Ramiro, a former employee of the company Isabel had been fighting against, the very company whose owner was involved in the case now accusing her. Ramiro had been called as a witness for the prosecution, but what no one knew was that he held a secret that could change the outcome of the trial. With trembling hands and a weary expression, he stepped up to the witness stand and briefly glanced at Marcos, who met his gaze with a mix of anticipation and skepticism. The room was silent, and everyone could sense that something important was about to unfold. Ramiro took a deep breath, gathering his courage before speaking in a low, hoarse voice. "I know I'm supposed to be a witness for the prosecution," he began, "but there's something I need to confess." He glanced briefly at Isabel, whose expression was one of surprise but also calm. Ramiro quickly looked away, clearly embarrassed, before turning back to face the court and the jury with newfound determination. Isabel was never guilty. All the accusations against her were fabricated. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Marcos, trying to maintain control, called for silence, but the shock of Ramiro's words was undeniable. The audience struggled to comprehend the turn of events. As everyone absorbed the revelation, Ramiro continued with growing confidence. "I was pressured by the owner of the company Isabel was suing. They knew that if she kept investigating, she would expose corruption and fraud involving large sums of money and government kickbacks." Ramiro's voice grew stronger, his courage building with each word. "They needed to stop her, and I was part of it." He turned to Isabel, meeting her gaze for a brief moment before looking away, embarrassed. "They paid me to plant evidence against her. I fabricated documents and records. I manipulated everything. I did it because I was desperate, and they promised to protect me." Marcos watched intently as Ramiro's words struck at the heart of the trial. He remained silent, though inside, his emotions were in turmoil. He understood that this testimony could change everything, but he also knew that more evidence was needed to officially clear Isabel of the accusations. "Do you have proof of what you're saying?" Marcos asked, his tone firm but less harsh than usual. He needed something solid to corroborate Ramiro's confession. The court required evidence, not just words. Ramiro nodded, pulling a stack of papers from his pocket and handing them over to the court assistant. Here are copies of emails and bank transfers I received. They paid me regularly to manipulate evidence against Isabel. I couldn't destroy all of it, and part of the records stayed with me. I couldn't get rid of them. The assistant handed the documents to Marcos, who reviewed them carefully. This was crucial, solid evidence that could prove Isabel's innocence. The room fell into a tense silence as everyone awaited Marcos's decision. Even though the evidence was in his hands, Marcos knew that Isabel's journey to justice was far from over. She dared to fight for something greater than herself. The silence deepened as Marcos flipped through the last pages. The room was filled with a mixture of anxiety and reverence. Isabel's breathing was audible, though she was far away. The moment was intense, and even those who had once doubted her now felt the weight of the situation. There she was, Isabel, a woman who had devoted her life to helping others and now saw her own life hanging in the balance of justice. Finally, Marcos lifted his gaze from the documents and looked at Isabel with a steady, emotion-filled expression. It was as if he wanted to silently convey all the respect and admiration he felt, as if this encounter were a promise that she was no longer alone, that he was by her side. As he turned toward the public and the jury, Marcos prepared to speak. He knew his words would be crucial, that the choice he made now would resonate throughout his life, and also in Isabel's and in the lives of all who had once believed in her integrity. He began recounting the details of the evidence he had just examined, describing how each transaction, each email, each piece of evidence pointed to a scheme of corruption and sabotage. His voice, once contained, now had a renewed strength, a tone of justice that seemed to affect everyone in the room. The jury members listened attentively, absorbing each word he spoke, their expressions serious as only the most critical moments can inspire. Some in the audience murmured in approval, while others simply nodded in silence, acknowledging the effort and courage Marcos had shown by standing firm. However, as he recounted the evidence, he felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just a formal explanation. It was a declaration of faith in Isabel, a recognition that he saw her as an innocent woman who had fought to do good and now deserved the truth to be restored. He paused at the end, and once again, silence fell over the room, charged with an indescribable energy. The public, the jury, and Isabel waited, as if every person there were holding their breath, waiting for the moment when justice would finally be served. Isabel, sitting on the defendant's bench, looked at Marcos with a mix of gratitude and relief. In that look, he could see the vivid memory of all the acts of kindness she had performed over the years. Marcos, still feeling the weight of what he had just declared, turned back to the court with a posture that reflected his commitment to the truth. His gaze was intense, as if, in that moment, he bore not only his responsibility as a judge, but also the silent promise he had made to himself many years ago when he was a poor, hungry, and invisible child. And there she was, Isabel, the woman who had changed his life, the one whose simple yet powerful acts of kindness had inspired in him the flame of justice that now burned brightly. He knew that for the jury and the public, every detail of this trial had been a revelation, but for him, it meant so much more. It was the chance to honor Isabel's generosity and, at the same time, to prove that justice could prevail even against the darkest and most manipulative forces. Taking a deep breath, still holding the documents Ramiro had given him, he felt their weight in his hands. It was as if those papers carried all of Isabel's acts of kindness, now transformed into evidence of her innocence, her courage, and her integrity. After a brief pause, Marcos looked at the jury and began speaking again, his voice resonating with clarity and determination. He described the personal impact Isabel had had on his life, explaining that although his role was that of a judge, he was also someone who owed her his own dignity. But before anyone could interpret this as bias, he emphasized the evidence, the transfers, the emails, every detail showing the plot. This woman, he declared, addressing the jury and the public, is not a criminal. She is someone who spent every day of her life fighting for justice, for those who have no voice. And today, we clearly see that those who tried to destroy her did so to protect themselves from the impact that the truth would have on their dark lives. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Some of the jury seemed moved, others nodded in agreement. Marcos could sense that, at that moment, they were not only recognizing the importance of the case, but also acknowledging the depth of the situation. At the end of his speech, Marcos turned to Isabel, his gaze intense in a way that few would understand, but which she immediately grasped. Without words, he was telling her that he had never forgotten who she was, what she had meant to him, and how, in some way, this moment was a tribute to her goodness. The court was still, as if waiting for the next gesture, the next movement that would seal Isabel's fate. Isabel, sitting there, kept her gaze steady and serene, knowing that no matter what the outcome, her truth had finally been revealed. For those who had once doubted her, the silence in the courtroom was almost sacred, heavy like the air in a cathedral, with each breath seeming to carry the weight of accumulated emotions. Isabel stood slowly, as if finally feeling the weight of the burden she had carried dissolving. She looked around, noticing that the faces that had once doubted her now showed expressions of surprise, some even of shame and regret. After all, each of them had at one time judged Isabel guilty, influenced by the fabricated evidence and accusations of a system that had long been manipulated against her. Isabel stepped forward, locking eyes with the jury. Her gaze reflected not just the pain of the months of trial, but also a serenity that few could understand. She didn't speak a word. She didn't need to. What she conveyed was deeper, something that everyone there could feel within themselves. Her expression was a mixture of relief and forgiveness, as if saying that, despite everything, she bore no ill will. Isabel was, above all, a woman of compassion, someone who had chosen to fight for those no one saw, and now, even in the face of her own pain, she showed the same generosity. Marcos watched her every movement with deep pride and respect. He knew, more than anyone else in the room, the true extent of Isabel's character and how much this woman had inspired his life and shaped his vision of justice. Seeing her there, dignified and serene after everything she had endured, was a living reminder of why he had chosen this path. When Isabel sat back down, the head judge took the floor, thanking the jury for their service and asking them to deliberate on the facts. It was the crucial moment. Everyone awaited the verdict that would determine not only Isabel's freedom but also the integrity of the justice she had fought so hard for. The jury left to deliberate, and the room remained filled with tense silence. Isabel, still seated, closed her eyes for a moment as if absorbing the energy of the space, every emotion, every glance that now returned the respect and trust that had once been taken from her. She felt a strange peace, as if she knew that no matter the outcome, her truth had prevailed. When the jury returned, the court stood in respect, and Isabel opened her eyes to face the moment with the same serenity that had accompanied her throughout her journey. The jury spokesperson stood, holding the verdict, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze, as if everyone there were caught in the expectation. Finally, the words were spoken, "Not guilty on all charges." A murmur of relief and surprise spread through the room, but for Isabel, the verdict was more than a declaration of innocence. It was confirmation that her life, her fight, and her integrity had finally been recognized. She smiled faintly, feeling free at last. The court, which had once seemed like a place of judgment and pain, now felt filled with a sense of relief, almost a silent celebration of the justice that had finally triumphed. Isabel, still processing the impact of the verdict, felt a wave of emotions she could barely contain as applause began to fill the courtroom. She looked around, absorbing every face, every look that had once judged her, but now greeted her with respect and admiration. Marcos, however, remained where he was, watching her with quiet pride. He knew that for Isabel, this victory was much more than just an acquittal. It was the living proof that her life, her dedication to others, had been worthwhile. He slowly approached, knowing that this was the moment to close a chapter that had begun years before, when he was just a poor, invisible child on the street, and their paths had first crossed. When their gazes met, no words were needed to understand the depth of what it meant. Marcos extended his hand, and Isabel took it, feeling the same connection that had once united them so purely and spontaneously. That handshake wasn't just a gesture of gratitude. It was a silent promise that everything she had sown, every act of kindness and justice, would continue to grow. As they left the courtroom, Isabel was greeted by a crowd of supporters, many of whom were former clients, people she had once helped in their darkest moments. There were mothers with children, young people freed from unjust convictions, elderly people who had kept their homes thanks to her. Each hug, each smile, carried a story of gratitude and recognition. And for the first time in a long while, Isabel felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. But the most moving moment came when a young woman, tears in her eyes, approached with a drawing made by a child. A portrait of Isabel with an aura of light around her, like a guardian angel. The young woman explained that her late brother had drawn this after Isabel helped him with an unjust case. "Now I finally understand what he meant,"